The first step for our miter station build is to cut all of our material to rough size. We're using 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood, and I'm cutting pieces to make the top, the bottom, the internal dividers, the sides, and I'll move my fence over and cut my wider piece that makes the back of the cabinet. Once I have all these pieces cut, I'll grab my track saw and use the track saw to cut the pieces to final length. Now you'll notice I'm ripping off a thin strip off these pieces. That's to bring them down to final size and give me two nice clean edges. I like the track saw for cutting my pieces to length because I don't have to worry about trying to run long, narrow pieces through the table saw. Once I have those pieces cut with the track saw, I do go ahead and bring them to final size at the table saw. This is just an old habit. With everything cut to size, it's over to the workbench and I start laying out where I'm going to put my pocket screws. Now here I'm using a Kreg R3 pocket hole jig. This allows me to move the jig around the workpiece because they're so large. I don't want to have to move the workpiece around the jig, especially on those ends. I've got a bunch of pocket hole screws spaced roughly 10 to 12 inches apart, and we're going to go ahead and jump ahead here so you don't have to watch me drill all those holes. I will say, as I drill the holes in the sides, I do take a good amount of time to make sure that I lay out where all my joinery is going to go, so I ensure once I start assembling the cabinet, I have all the holes drilled already. And I also like to position holes, at least pocket hole screws, on the outside of the cabinet box so that they angle away from the edges of the plywood. I think this makes it for a little bit of a stronger finished result. With all those holes drilled, I can go ahead and start assembling the cabinet. You can see I grabbed one of my Kreg right angle clamps. This specific clamp has the little peg that fits into the pocket hole, and on large pieces like this, I think it really makes the job quite a bit easier. And it's just a matter of working around the cabinet, driving screws into the pieces until I get everything laid out and screwed together. And you'll notice I go around and I kind of make sure I keep lining up my pieces so that the edges are nice and flush with each other. Once I have the screws in the back, I put the other side in. This one really doesn't need the clamp because it's very well supported by the other pieces, and we're ready to spin that piece around and start installing the two center dividers. Basically, these are going to divide our miter station into 3 different cabinet boxes, and they'll help produce a lot of rigidity for the cabinet. The goal with this piece was to have these long, straight pieces of plywood that will add a lot of strength and almost work somewhat like a torsion box construction, so that over time the cabinet won't have a tendency to sag and stay nice and straight through the middle. That's especially why I used a full 3/4 inch piece of plywood for the back. Now, this station is also going to be on casters, so we wanted to make sure that it would have that extra rigidity, but also because we might have a situation where we can get at the back if it's out in the middle of a shop for some reason, we could potentially use that back of the cabinet for other types of storage, maybe hooks, things like that. So just kind of future-proofing the design there. As I go, I make sure to double check all my measurements and make sure everything is nice and square. The time to fix something that's out of square is as soon as you find it, so there's never too much time to be spent making sure everything's just nice and in place. Then it's just a matter of cutting some pieces. These are going to make little cubbies for different types of tools and things, and they're going to be the risers for the miter station. So the miter saw will sit in between those 2 boxes with a nice flat surface all the way across, where we can also attach our miter saw fence. And now I'm using my favorite Kreg K5 pocket hole jig for these smaller pieces. It is a great quick tool, and I just have it clamped actually to my table saw outfeed table. So if you missed that video, definitely go check it out. Once I have all those pocket holes drilled, just start driving them into place. Again, take your time, make sure everything's nice and straight and square, and you will have good results. You can see I'm definitely not shy with the number of screws that I use. Again, I'm putting a screw roughly every 8 to 10 inches. And you'll also notice I have pocket holes going in both directions. I'm going to use these holes along the back edge to help secure my top panel that will end up being where my my workpiece rides. And I've got my piece flipped over now, and I'm drilling holes for my casters. I decided I wanted to use just 4 casters, and these are the same casters that we use on the Infinity Heavy Duty Tool Stand. So if you're looking for a good set of casters, I highly recommend those. We'll have a link down in the description, as well as links to just about all the different tools we're using to build this project. So definitely check out the description below. With the casters installed, I went ahead and dropped the whole cabinet down onto the floor, and I added a couple of divisions in my cubby areas. These will add a little bit of stiffness to my top so that my workpiece is nicely supported and not likely to sag. And for that top, I'm using plain old melamine coated particle board. Now, many people on a project like this that's just shop furniture won't take the time to sand these pieces. I plan to actually put a finish on these. I'm going to use a General Finishes water-based milk paint, and it really has a tendency to raise grain if you don't sand the plywood. And I like to think of projects like this as I would just about any other project. If I was making, say, kitchen cabinets, I would have sanded all the pieces before I put them together. And honestly, that would have been a lot easier than sanding it all put together. But I bit the bullet and went ahead and sanded everything down with some 180 grit paper. And I'm really glad I did that. Whenever I build a piece of furniture like this, even if it's just shop furniture, I treat it as something that really demands my fullest attention, and it helps me learn each and every time I build something like this to create a better finished product. For the doors of the miter saw station, I'm using again the same 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood and just cutting all the pieces to size at the table saw. Doors will really help keep the stuff that's in the cabinets nice and dust free, at least a lot better than if the cabinet had no doors on it at all. And it also helps hide some of that mess. Once I have them cut the size, I will go ahead and give them a good sanding. This is a lot easier work than it was sanding up that cabinet box. And once I have them all sanded up, I'll head over to the router table where I'll put an 1/8 inch radius round over on all edges. Once I have all the edges rounded over on my cabinet doors, it's time to drill all the holes for my hinges. I'm using a half overlay European style hinge on these doors. So I grab again my Craig European style hinge or concealed hinge jig, whichever it's called, and just knock out all those holes. This really is a pretty quick process, and with only 6 doors on the project, it goes pretty quick. Once I had all the large 35mm holes drilled, I switched drill bits and I drilled the small pilot holes for the hinge screws. The next step, it's back over to the cabinet box to put in my shelf pin holes. Again, I'm using a Craig shelf pin hole jig, and this makes pretty quick work of putting in all those holes. I go ahead and do this on the ground. It would have been a little bit easier had I had the cabinet box up on the workbench, but I survived. With only 3 cabinet boxes to do this job, only took a matter of maybe 10 minutes or so, and I had all my holes drilled and ready for my shelves. Speaking of shelves, I went ahead and cut those out of the same 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood and gave them the same 1/8 inch radius round over that I did the cabinet doors. This just gives a nice finished edge, and I went ahead and sanded those up as well. The Mirka Duro sander is what I've been using in the shop for a couple of years now, and it really is one of the nicest sanders I have used, bar none. It feels like an air sander in use. It has a great dust collection system available for it, and hopefully you can see in this video that it does an absolutely phenomenal job of collecting almost 100% of the dust that the sander makes. Really almost makes it look like it's not doing anything, but trust me, it's doing a phenomenal job. Even though this is just a piece of shop furniture, we're going to go ahead and finish it using some General Finishes water-based milk paint. Now this is actually an acrylic-based paint, but it has a look much like a traditional milk paint. It's a really nice thick finish. So if you're spraying it, you may need to thin it as much as 10 or 15%. And use the appropriate needle and tip for your spray gun. General Finishes has a great amount of information to help you get good results with their finished products, and I've never been disappointed with the General Finishes milk paint for sure. Now this is the same Tuscan red that we used on our table saw outfeed table build, and I think finishing a project like this not only helps protect it, especially in an unair conditioned shop like we work in here in Florida, but it really just makes it for a really nice project. And gives you a nice finished result. Not only is it good practice, especially for spraying unusual odd angles and things like that, if you're new to spraying finishes, this is a great way to get your feet wet, but it's also going to just make you feel better every time you walk in the shop to see a nice, finished, complete project that you built. And for me, it just makes it all just a little bit more enjoyable each time I walk out in the shop. I can look at these pieces that I built, even though it's just a miter saw station or a table saw outfeed table, and I can really take pride in my shop. One of my favorite things about the General Finishes water-based products or finishes like the milk paint is how fast they dry. I sprayed 3 coats of this Tuscan red milk paint on every piece of the project, doors, shelves, and the cabinet box itself, and was able to get my finishing done in a single day, and everything was dry to the point that I was ready to put the doors on by the end of the day. So this can save a ton of time over other more quote-unquote traditional finishes, especially oil-based finishes, because you can get the entire project done with multiple coats. The dry time's quick and easy, and if you take a close look, you can actually see in the time lapse here how quickly that finish goes from being glossy and wet to being a nice satin or matte finish and dry, just about ready for a second coat here. One of the little accessories that I like to use when spraying items like this are the VersaSpin turntable and painter's pyramids. The turntable, as you can see, has got a few painter's pyramids on it, and it lets me really easily turn the workpiece and get nice, quick, even finishing. This is great for things like doors and shelves and all those little flat pieces. The painter's pyramids create a very small point of contact, so even if you have areas that are a little damp, especially you're spraying multiple coats and you're kind of rushing the process, the pyramids help not create a big mark on the workpiece, and the workpiece with that kind of flashed off finish is much less likely to stick to that nice little point of the pyramid. So definitely worth considering to add to your finishing accessories. The next day, when all the finish was dry, I went ahead and installed my countertops, I guess you would call them, on the cabinet using one of those Craig right angle clamps to hold the piece in place after I got it all lined up, and just drove all my pocket screws into the pre-drilled holes. And once I got all the pocket screws filled, I decided to add a few more holes on the front edges because there's just a couple of places where I just simply can't drive a pocket screw from underneath. So these holes could easily be filled with a plug of some form down the road if I needed to, and I can throw my saw in place. Next step is to install the doors, and to do this I actually made a simple jig out of some scrap plywood, and it just has 4 holes in it that correspond with the 4 holes in my hinges, and then it's Simply drop those hinges into the pre-drilled holes on the door, screw them in place, and screw them to the cabinet itself, and make those adjustments so that all the gaps line up nice and perfect. It's a pretty easy process. It takes a little bit of time opening and closing those doors, but once you get them all lined up, they're going to look really good. Once I have all the doors installed, I step back and take a overall look at the cabinet, because I need all those doors to have nice, consistent gaps and to really make the finished product look good. And so I'll take a few minutes adjusting one door here or there until I get everything laying nice and flat, even and with nice even gaps. And once I have that done, I'll add some little stick-on door bumpers so the doors close with a nice thud. Next, I decided to make some edge banding for my top to dress it up and add a protective detail. I had a piece of hickory sitting in the lumber rack just waiting for a project like this. So I took it to the joiner and planer and milled it up till it was nice and smooth into a good dimension to make those edge banding strips from. With everything milled up, it's over to the table saw, and I use an Infinity 24-tooth ripping saw blade in the table saw and the Jessam table saw stock guides. I've really become a big fan of the Jessam stock guides for this type of work. They help keep these narrow pieces nice and straight and get good consistent milling. You do have to use a skinny long push stick to kind of feed it through, but definitely worth the little bit extra work. Then I switched to a quarter kerf blade and milled a groove in the one face of all of the edge banding strips, and that'll accept a spline. Then it's over to the router table, and with a slot cutting router bit, 1/4 inch kerf, I cut a corresponding slot in the tabletops that'll also accept that spline for the edge banding. The final step is to cut the pieces of edge banding to final length. I do this at the table saw because my miter station is not complete, and then I switch to a quarter kerf blade and put a half lap joint in the front and back pieces of the edge banding, and that's pretty much all the joinery. Then it's a matter of just gluing the spline in place and adding additional glue and clamping everything up. Take your time with the cutting process of your edge banding so you get nice tight joints all the way around. This is a really easy type of joinery to make and really fine tune to get perfect lengths. So definitely one of those measure twice scenarios, and then just clamp everything up with some nice cabinet maker's clamps and let the glue dry. No need for mechanical fasteners here, brads or nails or anything like that. You just don't need them. The old saying, you can never have too many clamps, is always true. I grabbed a bunch of extra clamps and just put a clamp roughly every 12 inches or so to ensure that I had no little spring areas or gaps in my edge banding. I've never had a dedicated place in my shop for my Triton spindle sander, so I decided to make a shelf to attach to the side of my miter station. I made some nice curved brackets. These actually match the brackets on my table saw outfeed table. K5 makes short work of adding all the pocket screw holes that I needed, and used a clamp to hold my pieces while I drove those screws to ensure that everything was nice and aligned. Hit it with a quick coat of General Finishes paint to make sure it matched, and piece of melamine and some leftover edge banding for the top, and I used a piece of scrap plywood as a spacer to locate the shelf on the side of the cabinet to get the height just right. And now I have a permanent home for my spindle sander. The final piece of this puzzle is the dust collection shroud and the miter saw fence. Now for dust collection, I just used some leftover plywood and made a nice large surround to close in and capture most of that dust. And I put a big gulp dust hood at the back so I could hook up a nice big 4-inch line directly from my dust collector. The fence we used is the Infinity 48-inch miter saw fence system. Definitely check out the video we have on that fence down below. It goes through all the features it has, includes a couple of stops, and really is a great solution for a station just like this. I hope you enjoyed this build and it helps you get some good ideas on ways to improve your shop. If you'd like to build a version of our miter saw station for your very own, head over to infinitytools.com where you can download a complete set of plans for this exact station.